Well, good evening and welcome to the University of Wyoming Laramie County Extension in the Laramie County Master Gardeners Gardening for Success seminar series. And tonight's program is going to be on Vegetable Gardening 101. And our speaker tonight is Mike Heath, and also a Master Gardener. And we'll cover the basics and probably a refresher for some of you and something new for some of you others. But if you have questions or you've just put it down, if you put your cursor down at the bottom, you'll see the little chat symbol come up. Just put your question in the chat box, and when Mike takes a breather, we can ask him your questions. But with that, we will get going with tonight's program, and Master Gardener Mike Heath is going to lead us through Vegetable Gardening 101. Mike, it's all yours.
Thanks, Catherine. Welcome, everybody. Glad to see you made it tonight, and I hope you really enjoy this and come back for a future seminar series as well. We do plan on doing this about once a week. We haven't set a schedule yet, and we haven't decided which topic is going to be taught when yet, but I did just get notified that next Thursday is going to be irrigation systems, and I'm teaching it. And thank you, Catherine. I really appreciate that. So, anyhow, we're going to get going here with Veggies 101, and this really is not working. Okay. There it goes. Okay. This is the very basics on vegetable gardening. We're going to touch on a lot of topics. We're not going to go in depth into anything tonight. This is just how to get started, really for beginners. So if you've been through the Master Gardener course, you've heard a lot of this already. Might be a real good refresher for you. Just some things to remember to get started with. But we'll get into some of the more detailed topics later on in future seminars. So why do you want to grow your own vegetables? Well, to begin with, growing your own vegetables is just fun. In fact, gardening in general is fun. Getting out in dirt is relaxing. It relieves stress, takes you back to your childhood, you know, brings out your inner child in you. But it's good and healthy just emotionally before you even get into anything else. But for vegetables, you're going to find that the vegetables that you grow at home have better nutrition. They're healthier for you. You have a lot more control over them. Any food that goes through the processor, a commercial processor, and it's nothing against the processors, but just the way they have to handle the food, it loses nutritional value. And from the day it's picked or the moment it's picked, food starts to degrade. And the longer it sits out before being processed, the more nutrients are lost. And then in some of the processing methods itself, nutrients are lost. And on big farms, they don't have quite the control you're going to have at home as far as bringing those foods indoors and getting them processed right away. You control what fertilizers and chemicals are used on your garden. You don't have to just go out and buy a bag of whatever the store happens to have and put it on your garden and hope it's the right thing. You can look at your vegetables. You can choose what chemicals need to go in there. And you'll do a lot of that through your soil tests that we'll talk about here in a minute. But you'll know just what nutrients you have to use, that you don't have to just go out and buy something general and hope you've done the right thing. As far as chemicals go, you get a choice as what chemicals you get to use, what chemicals you need, or you can use no chemicals at all. That's herbicides, pesticides, anything going in your garden. You have total control over it when you're doing it yourself. You control the harvest and storage. One of the neat things about that is with the harvest itself, and I'll use tomatoes as an example. Tomatoes commercially are picked a little bit on the green side, and they're expected to ripen as they get to the store in transit. And you lose flavor that way. Because like I said earlier, from the moment a vegetable's picked, it starts to degrade. It starts to lose nutrients. You will build some flavors. Those sugars build up from the starches as they ripen, but it's not quite the same. You can go out and you pick a vine, fresh tomato that's ripe on the vine, and the flavor is entirely different. I spent well over 60 years despising tomatoes. Wouldn't eat them, refused to eat them. I thought they tasted terrible. And then I grew some one year, and the flavor was so much better that, yeah, I grow some every year now. Just, if nothing else, I'll grow cherry tomatoes to have as a treat when I'm out in the garden doing something else. I'll just reach over and pick a few and pop them in my mouth, and that's my treat while I'm there, and just keeps me going, and it just tastes great. And that's exactly the big reason for it, is the taste. Oh, the taste of fresh vegetables. You're just not going to do any better at all. So planting your garden. You got to get this started early, preferably the year prior to planting. And one of the reasons is you want to know what you want to plant. Pick something that your family's going to eat. You know, in my case, I love asparagus. I'm the only person in my family that eats it. So I don't have a lot of it, pretty much just enough to get me through the year. And like I say, nobody else will touch it. So I plant very little of that, or I have very little of that in my asparagus bed. But that goes for everything. For example, if you are planting summer squash, but nobody in your family eats summer squash, why plant it? It's just going to take time, effort, and take up space in your garden you can use for something else. So choose those plants that you're actually going to eat. And pick a sunny location to put your garden in. Vegetables in general just love sun. The more they get, the happier they are. So you want to try to plan your beds so that it's away from the house, away from trees, or away from tall shrubs, anything that's going to shade that garden. And you want to try to get it in the sun from the moment the sun comes up in the morning until the sun goes down at night. Not always possible, I understand. And that's not saying your vegetables won't grow in partial shade. They just won't grow as well as they will in a sunny location. And the next thing you want to do is get a soil sample. You want to do this early in the year, preferably spring. And we use the CSU testing lab mainly because it's accessible to us. There's also one over at the University of Nebraska, but CSU is 45 minutes down the road. And if you have to, except for right now, you can just take your sample down there and drop it off. Usually we just go through the mail, and they can get you sample jars. And when LCCC comes back open, Catherine at the extension office can get jars for you because they have them there. And of course, the phone numbers are on the screen for you right now if you want to jot those down real quick. And this will also be recorded so you can pick it up later. But get that soil test. That is just so critical. As you're doing your test, and the diagram that you see is just an example of a garden plot. And those X's would just be spaces that you go out and take your soil sample from. Because you don't want to do it in just one spot, because all you're getting if you do that is what the soil is like in that one spot. And it does change. When I put in one of my fields here a couple of years ago, I broke it into 4 quadrants, took a soil sample out of each quadrant. They were all different, and they weren't that far apart. So take a variety of spots in your garden, dig down about 4 inches, dig a little bit of soil up, about a scoop, and when you get it all together, mix it up real good. Break up the clumps, and then set it out on some newspaper to dry for a few days. You don't want to send water to the testing lab. You want to send the soil. That's what they're looking for. After it's dried out, fill your soil sample jar up, follow the instructions that come with it, and mail it in. You're going to have soil left over. Just put it back in your garden. It'll be there for use later on, and that'll get your sample. The soil test results will be emailed back to you by the CSU testing lab, and you'll get a hard copy. And they make it very easy to understand. They tell you exactly what nutrients are missing, what you need to put into the soil, and exactly how much. Then you want to draw a diagram of your garden plot. This tells you pretty much where each type of plant is going to go. For example, you may have a row of squash, and you want to make sure that you don't put that too close to the next row of whatever, say it's beans, so that your vines are getting into your beans. And that's where the diagram comes in handy, because you can draw it to scale and space everything out so that you know about how far apart you need to put your plants. Also helps you understand how many plants you need to plant and what seed to buy. Now, I suggest doing this the fall before, and the reason will come apparent here in just a second as you select your varieties and your seed. So select what vegetables you're going to plant that fall prior. And your best selection, as far as what you're going to plant, you're going to find either online or through a catalog. And personally, I would suggest using both. They don't necessarily have the same information online as the catalog does. So if you use both of them together, you'll get a good idea of what how the plant's going to act for you and how it's going to grow. And always select plants with a short growing season. If you can get something under 60 days, fantastic. With vegetables, you're probably going to find most everything is going to be in the 60 to 70 day range, and sometimes up to 80. You get beyond that, you're really pushing your luck. We do have a short growing season here. We've actually been lucky the last couple of years, and it's been a little bit longer than normal, but you can't count on that. So try to pick something with a shorter growing season as possible. And purchase your seed in advance. I say here January to March, go ahead and have your seed ready. Frankly, I buy mine in December, and I tried to get some additional seed in March this year, and the seed companies were out. They had already sold out of everything that I wanted additional. So the earlier you can buy your seed, the better off you are. When you get your seed in, don't just throw it up on a shelf. That seed is a living organism, and it will degrade with temperature fluctuations, and especially with heat. So store your seeds in the vegetable drawer of your refrigerator, or if you've got one of these little, like a beer refrigerator or something, you can put them in there to get them out of the way. But make sure you keep them cool, not frozen, but cool. Some seeds you want to start in advance, and things like peppers, squash, pumpkins, you can go ahead and start prior to the season, but check your seed packet to back up when you're going to start those seeds. It's going to take anywhere from 7 to 14 days for most seeds to germinate, and then you want to have them in the house growing for at least 6 weeks. So you're looking about 8 weeks prior to planting that you want to start, which is going to put you in the neighborhood, depending on what the seed is, around April 1st, starting your seed. If you start too much earlier than that with some seeds, you're going to have a long, gangly plant that's going to be hard to deal with. If you wait too much later, you may be too late getting them in the ground. So pay attention to what your seed packet says. And also read the seed packet as far as planting depth, because there's a wide variety of planting depths for your seed as well. Anywhere from just scattering it on the surface of the soil to planting it down to a ½ inch, ¼ inch below the surface. Then you want to prepare your soil mix. And a lot of folks will just go out to the box stores and just buy a bag of potting soil, fine and dandy, but that's not the best thing to use, at least not by itself. You want to mix that about 50-50 with vermiculite. And what that does, it lightens that potting soil up. Because after you've watered potting soil by itself, it packs down really hard, and it makes it tough for that plant to germinate and put roots down and get leaves back up through it. So if you put the vermiculite in it, it doesn't do anything at all to enhance the nutrients in the soil, but it does lighten it, so it makes it easier for that root to go down. You want to select and fill your pots, and make sure that you size your pot to the vegetable that you're going to grow in it. For example, I typically will use a 2-inch pot to start peppers in, but for squash and pumpkins, things of that nature, I'll go to a 3 or 4-inch pot, and that's primarily for the amount of roots they put out and the length of the roots. And even then, with those vining plants, a lot of times the peppers will, or not the peppers, but the vining plants will run their roots down through the bottom of the pot. And you got to be real careful taking those out and don't harm those roots. You may end up having to even just cut the pot off around the roots and not even try to save it. Once you've got your seed in, make sure you cover it in the tray with a plastic dome. That keeps the humidity up. It'll also help regulate the temperature a little bit. Then place the tray and the seeds and dome in a warm, lighted location. Now, something I've found is those trays, the plastic trays, if you try to pick them up, they will fold on you and you'll dump everything all over the ground. So what I've started doing is taking just a piece of plywood and sliding under those trays, and that's what I actually lift them by. Masonite, plywood, something along that line. It doesn't have to be a lot or anything heavy, but just something to help support that tray so it doesn't fold in half on you. That warm lighted location needs to be at about 75 degrees soil temperature. So if your room is not 75 degrees, of course the soil temperature is not going to reach it. So you have to do something such as a warming mat or something underneath it to bring that soil temperature up that help those seeds germinate. Now, it's not saying they won't germinate with a lower soil temperature, but they'll take a long time and you stand a lot better chance of the seed just rotting in the soil and you get nothing out of it at all. And as far as the light goes, most often a southern facing window does not necessarily work well. It's better than a north facing window, but you have to have additional lighting for those plants because once they start germinating, you're going to need about 10 to 12 hours of light a day. And you need to have those lights. And a fluorescent shop light will do the job just fine for most of what we will do. Just make sure that your light is within 2 to 4 inches of the top of that new seedling. And you have to put it on something so that you can raise it periodically as those seedlings grow. Because for example, your pepper plants should be about 8 inches tall when they get set out. And so you're gonna have to be able to raise your lights up at least that far. Hang them on chains, strings, pulley systems. I've found that the bike pulley systems they sell over at Harbor Freight work great on those lights. Just pull the string down, raises the lights up, and it's wonderful, makes it real easy. Some seeds you can just direct sow. Things like corn, beans, can just be direct sown in the ground. You could use either a planter or you can sow by hand. I usually plant about 3,000 square feet of garden a year, and I do it with a planter. I can do that in about an hour using a hand planter. Doing it by hand, I used to take all day to get everything in, and my back felt it at the same time. Your bulbous and root vegetables like potatoes, onions, garlic, things of that nature are easiest planted in a trench. The picture that you see on the left is garlic that was planted last fall. And I just scooped the trench out about 4 inches deep, which is what was recommended for that particular variety of garlic. Place the bulbs in and make sure that you put the root end down and the growing end up, because that's a very common mistake on root on bulb vegetables like that. And then just fill the trench in. Mulch it real good, and they'll just overwinter just fine. And mine were up in March, about 4 inches before I realized they were actually out of the ground. And I had about 4 inches of mulch on top of them. And I think out of 1,000 plants, maybe a half dozen didn't come up. If you're planting by seedlings, you got to take a little bit more care with them. Definitely don't plant those seedlings until after the first or the last frost. This year, the last frost is estimated to be approximately May 24th, and it does vary a little bit each year because it is just that. It's an average frost date, and you're going to have some frost dates that'll be before that and some last frost dates after that. When you average those together, that's when you get your average for that year, and it's based on the year previous. Usually that means about June 1st is a good time to plant. I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but you're better off waiting until June 1st before you plant anything in the ground outside. Before you plant those seedlings, though, make sure that you harden them off. And what that means is take your seedlings outside during the day after it's warmed up a little bit in the morning. Put them in a protected area that gets sun, but not the wind. and just let them sit there all day. Bring them in the late afternoon before it starts cooling off, and then take them out again the next day. And do that for about a week, and that'll start getting your plants prepared for going in the ground after June 1st. Make sure that you plant the seedlings at the same depth as they are in the pot. What that means is the soil in the pot should be level with the ground soil. If you plant them too deep, you take a chance on the stem rotting. If you plant them too shallow, you can dry out the roots. And either one of those scenarios will kill the plant. And you've already got way too much work in them by this time. Now the real work begins. And you got to tend this garden for the next however many months it is before it ripens. And as you can see in this photo, this was a lavender field that I let get away from me a couple of years ago. And those weeds are actually about 6 or 7 feet tall. And I had about an acre of that I had to tear out, and I don't ever want to do that again. So make sure you stay on top of the weeds. Even if you have to do a little bit every day, don't let them get away from you. It's just a nightmare. Watering is very important, especially around here. We do recommend the drip system of some sort, and we'll go into drip systems, irrigation systems next week. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it right now. Right here, I'm putting in a drip system on the lavender, and I'm using a 1/2-inch tubing with a 1/4-inch tubing and a dripper on the end of it, which I have since changed out all of those to use perforated 1/4-inch tubing to more evenly distribute the water. If you use overhead or spray, you're just opening the door to funguses and diseases in your plants. Because once the plants start growing and you got a lot of foliage on them, they're not going to dry real fast when you start getting inside the plant itself. It's just too dense for good air movement. So that overhead spraying just doesn't really work too well. And I had someone today tell me how she had a hard time watering because her hours at work were just so screwy that she never could guarantee she was going to be home to water. And the answer to that's put it on a timer. Just like your lawn irrigation system, a timer can tell it to come on certain days at a certain time for a certain length of time, to shut off. And you don't have to be out there constantly monitoring the timer itself. And they're fairly cheap. I mean, you can get as expensive as you want, but you can get a timer at Home Depot for about $50 and put it on your system. You want to make sure that you water deep and consistently. And now by deep, I don't mean turn it into mud, but make sure the water goes down deeply. And in the summer, sometimes what you may have to do is water for a half hour or so, turn it off, wait for a couple hours and water again. And that'll help the water go deep, but it won't just puddle on the surface and turn itself into mud. Make sure that you do that consistently. Keep the water about the consistent moisture level, not too dry, not too wet, and with no ups and downs in the moisture level either. You want to monitor your soil for moisture. Now, the way you would do that is go out near your plants, dig down about 4 inches, take out some of the soil, and just make a ball out of it in your hand. If it clumps and forms a hard ball, it's perfect. If it runs through your fingers, it's obviously too wet. If you either can't dig it out or you have to use a pickaxe to get to it, it's way too dry. And you may have to use that water for an hour, wait a couple hours and come back water again, because water's just going to run off of that. Or if it just turns to dust, it's too dry as well. So keep track of your soil for the moisture content. Watch the weather. I've heard Catherine say many times that gardeners are weather watchers, and yes, we are. Obviously, there's no sense in watering if it's pouring down rain, but at the same time, come about July, you're going to find it's going to be very, very dry, and you may have to increase your watering. In fact, you probably will. And there again, checking your soil moisture is going to be the key to that, and knowing just what you need and when. And so you may have to adjust your timer. For fertilization, don't rely on your soil to be your fertilizer. That's where the soil report comes in so handy. It'll tell you what nutrients you're missing. I found in my location, I'm missing calcium. and I'm constantly adding more calcium to the soil. But I found that only through a soil analysis. So look at that thing, and after you get it, and just act accordingly, according to the recommendations. Like I said, they do a wonderful job at CSU. You may use a foliar fertilizer, which means just spray it on the leaves. You may put it into the soil or inject it in the drip system. You have all kinds of methods to fertilize once you have a good irrigation system set up. And keep it on your plants, because a lot of times they'll tell you what they need. They'll change color. They may come up with blossom end rot, which is the next bullet. Tomatoes and peppers are especially susceptible to that, and what that is a dark, mushy area at the blossom end of the fruit. Doesn't mean the entire fruit is no good, so you don't have to throw it all away, but you do have to cut that off. And you can't eat that, but the rest of it will still be okay for you as long as you're just using it yourself. But it's not something that you want, and it makes for a very ugly piece of fruit. And then there's pests. And this is not a pest. If you have these in your garden, bow down and worship them, because these are just the queens of the garden. They're the ladybugs, and they will eat your pests. And they're very good at it. I just got some for some aphids that I had in the hothouse, and it was like watching a rolling wave as ladybugs started eating the aphids. And I wish I'd taken some video of it, because it was just a sight to see. And I include people in the pests, because you may have that pesky neighborhood kid that comes over and decides that your tomato plants are his treat, or your strawberries or whatever. And I've had that in the past. And they can be as big a pest as insects. Rodents, we have pocket gophers out where I'm at, and out in the county, they're all over the place. Rabbits are rodents, and they'll get into your gardens, and you may have to do something about those. Sometimes that's fencing them off. There's all kinds of methods to take care of those pests, but do keep an eye on them. But if you have insects, make sure of what you're actually looking at. Not all insects are harmful pests. For example, this ladybug, good one to have around. If you see ladybugs, you want to keep them. Pesticides, I caution against those. I don't like them myself, but I also understand they're very necessary at times. But you want to use them very carefully and make sure that it's not going to harm your beneficial insects before you use a pesticide. And whenever you can, use beneficial insects, and you can buy these. I got my last batch of ladybugs on Amazon, and that was actually the best batch I've had yet. When you check for insects, check the tops and the undersides of the leaves, because a lot of times the insects will try to get under the leaves to get out of the sun. And check the terminal buds, which is top of the plant, because there are insects that will start eating there first, and at the stems, because some will eat there. On corn, peel the end of the husk back and check for worms. They'll be very obvious if you have worms in your corn, because usually they're right at that end of the cob, and you'll notice them eating the corn itself in that area. And let's just say it's obvious what you have. And you can just peel those worms off, smush them, cut that part of the cob off, and go ahead and eat the corn. It's not going to hurt you a bit. In cabbage, check inside the leaves near the stem for cabbage loopers. That's where they like to start at. And it'll actually start getting a little bit sloppy and slimy in there as they eat if you've got a bad infestation. But basically, just look for holes, chew marks, browning of leaves, fruit, things like that, to give you an idea that you might have a problem. It's not necessarily going to be insects, but it's an indicator. And then you can start checking for the insects themselves. And then it's time to harvest. One of my favorite times of year. But you never harvest early in the morning. I know that's when it's cool and you think that's the best time to get out and pick these things. Not necessarily. You got to wait until that dew burns off. Otherwise, you take a chance on just transferring diseases back and forth between plants. And as soon as you get your fruit in, rinse it with cold water. Now, I caveat that, assuming that it's not something that you have dried in the field. is that you don't want to rinse. But ears of fresh corn, beans, peas, squash, things of that nature, as soon as you pick them, or as soon as possible, rinse them in fresh water, cool the temperature down. As we talked about earlier, as soon as that fruit is picked, then it starts to degrade. It's deteriorating. That's the metabolism in the plant. So cool it down, you slow that down, and it'll stay fresh for a little bit longer. So rinse it good with cold water and then dry it, because you don't want the water just sitting on the fruit either. And process it for storage as soon as possible. We will be doing a seminar on food storage and preservation later on, probably later in the summer as we start getting closer to harvest time. And after you've harvested and processed your food, then you can sit back and you can enjoy the fruits of your labor. This is the most fun out of all of it. It's because, like I said earlier, the taste is just so much better, the nutrition's better, and just the satisfaction that you did it yourself is wonderful. And we will open it up for questions. And if you want to write us later, or if you're listening to this out of the archives, you can always email us your questions at the email address that you see on the screen, and we will get back with you with those answers. So does anyone have any questions?
Well, that was great, Mike. Thank you. And I need to make a correction here on the, Becky, is that the correct email address?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
We went to that about 1.5 years ago.
Okay. You can also email me if you want. Either way, someone will get back to you to answer your questions. And I think one of the important things I'd like to pass on is when you amend your soil for the vegetable garden, please do not put manures in there. Do not put any sheep or cow or horse or llama, alpaca, bunny. Don't put any of that in there because of the salts.
Let me tack onto that, Catherine, if you don't mind. I'll interrupt you here for a second. I did that last year unknowingly. I bought compost not knowing that it was manure, all manure compost.
Yep.
And after it was dumped in the middle of the garden, I got told what it was, and I was under the assumption that it wasn't. And it totally killed my garden. Out of 1,800 corn seeds I planted, I had 2 stalks come up, and they were so misshapen, I just tilled them under. And weeds wouldn't even grow in the garden last year.
Yep, and that's the salt. So people talk about manures being hot, but that hot is a result of the salts. So it's not the nitrogen, it's not the phosphorus or potassium, but it's the salts in there. And horse manure is notorious for weed seeds. And right now I'm working on my vegetable garden and getting that going. And I put down black plastic and weed barrier fabric. I got my irrigation system underneath it, and I put everything on top of it because I don't like to weed. And I have better things to do than weed. So I do try to avoid that. But if you have any questions, comments, the Laramie County Master Gardeners are here to help. And I work for the University of Wyoming, Laramie County Extension Office. I'm the Laramie County horticulturist, and I teach these crazy people. And they teach me a lot of times, most of the time. So if you have questions, gardening questions, please call us or send us an email. And so Mike, here's a question for you.
Okay.
Can asparagus be planted in a stocked tank?
I don't know why it couldn't be. The only thing that would concern me about that is soil temperature in the winter, because you got more air circulation around that stock tank that may cool that soil temperature down. That'd be my only concern. Other than that, I don't see what the problem would be. But the thing about asparagus is it'll also grow almost anywhere. You can put it in a flower bed and it'll grow there, and it'll last you, good gosh, 20 years on an asparagus bed.
Yep. Yep. Asparagus does like to be watered. It's not drought tolerant, and none of these vegetables are drought tolerant. They need to be watered consistently. And Mike did talk about putting everything on a timer. And it is so important that you get your vegetables on drip irrigation or a soaker hose. You avoid overhead water, get them on a timer, and make sure they get good water all the time. Don't ever let your vegetable garden dry out. They're just, it'll be unhappy for everybody.
Made that mistake, you're correct.
Yeah, so there's a benchmark with all these plants. All these vegetables should be giving you back X amount of fruit. So for both tomatoes and peppers, or excuse me, tomatoes and potatoes, for every pound of potato you plant, you should get 10 pounds back. So 1 pound of potatoes planted equals 10 pounds harvested. And with tomato plants, a tomato plant should give you close to 10 pounds back. And that's a lot of fruit, a lot of good BLT sandwiches. Even the little cherry plants will give you a hefty harvest. And I weigh everything that comes out of my garden, or I count everything that comes out. So I know what that plant is doing, and then I keep a record of it. So you can let your inner micromanager out and play in the vegetable garden.
It's also fun just to see what the production is.
Yeah, it is. That way you know, are you on target or are you off target, or are you doing something right, or are you doing something wrong, and adjust your system as you go along. Okay. Well, this program's been recorded, and it'll be up on the Laramie County Extension YouTube channel. And I'll also pass it off to the Laramie County Master Gardeners, and hopefully they can get it up on their website. So Mike, I appreciate your time and effort in putting this together. It was amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And again, if you've got any questions, email the Laramie County Master Gardeners, or you can email me. Either way, we will answer your questions. Mike, anything else to add to this?
No, because we'll cover a lot of it in future seminars.
Okay. All right, great. Well, everybody have a great evening, and thanks for joining us.